Charlie Doyle knelt in the gravel of the Feather River at first light, sluice water numbing both hands, and prayed, as always, that today would not be the day some man in camp finally looked twice. The prayer had worked for 4 months. It was, Addie Doyle privately understood, the only kind of prayer that had ever worked for her, the kind she answered herself one careful morning at a time. She kept her hat low, her sleeves rolled to the wrist and never passed it, her voice pitched into the flat, unhurried register she had practiced alone in the dark until it stopped sounding like a performance. She had buried her brother in October. She had buried her own name a week later, in a shallow grave of her own digging, because a claim on Doyle Bar could not sit idle past the spring thaw without some other man's stake driven through the middle of it. 3 men were walking the boundary line that morning. She recognized the pace before she recognized the faces. Unhurried, proprietary, the walk of men measuring ground they intended to take. One of them put his boot flat on her lower marker stake and rocked it, testing how deep it had been driven.
That stake's surveyed and recorded. Touch it again, and you'll be explaining yourself to the alcalde instead of me.
The man looked up, unbothered, and Addie made herself hold his eyes instead of dropping them. A woman's instinct, she had learned, was to look away first, and a woman's instinct was the one thing on this riverbank she could not afford. A second man laughed and came closer than boundary business required, close enough that Addie smelled the whiskey still on him from the night before, close enough that his hand closed around her forearm through her rolled sleeve and stopped, for just a fraction of a second, on the wrongness of what he felt there. It was the fraction of a second Addie Doyle had spent 4 months dreading.
Careful, Wit. Charlie Doyle's touchy about his ground.
You think I did it?
The man called Wit let go before he had to think about why he'd wanted to keep holding on, and the third man, older, better dressed than a placer camp required, walked the line without hurrying, taking his time before he finally spoke.
Nobody's seen your brother in this camp since the frost, Doyle. Man doesn't have to die to lose a claim, he just has to stop being here to work it.
I'm here. I'm working it. That's what the code requires.
The code requires proof when a claim's disputed. And I'm disputing it?
Otis Crane said it the way a man states a fact already settled in his own favor, touched the brim of his hat with 2 fingers, and walked his boundary line back toward the main diggings without once raising his voice, which frightened Addie a great deal more than shouting would have. To understand why a man like Otis Crane wanted one modest claim on a crowded gravel bar, badly enough to threaten it in the open, you would have to go back further than Addie Doyle's arrival. Back to a feud between 2 families that had nothing to do with gold and everything to do with water, and a grudge Crane had been nursing so long he had stopped noticing its weight. But that came later. That morning Addie only knew that her 4 months of careful mornings had just run out, and that she had exactly until the next camp meeting to prove a dead man was still alive. The claim beside hers belonged to a man named Levi Hargrove, and Levi had watched the whole exchange from his own bank without moving, the way a man watches whether he already knows is coming his way whether he likes it or not. He crossed the shared boundary line once Crane's men were well out of earshot, unhurried, a shovel still over one shoulder, and looked at the stake Wit had rocked loose in its bed.
That'll want resetting before the ground dries around it crooked.
I know how to set a stake, Hargrove.
Didn't say you didn't.
He said it without heat, the way a man states a fact and moves on, and knelt to test the stake himself anyway, which Addie found more irritating than if he'd argued. Levi Hargrove worked the claim upriver of Doyle Bar and had done so alone since the previous September, when a rockslide above the ditch had taken his partner and left him with a share of ground too large for one man and a silence he had not much minded until lately. The 2 claims shared the same feeder ditch, dug 2 summers back by men who no longer worked this stretch of river, and the miners' code was specific on one point neither of them could avoid. A shared ditch meant shared maintenance, shared water rights, and, should either claim come under formal dispute before the camp, a shared obligation to testify to what each had actually seen the other man do.
Crane's been talking about your claim in the store for 2 weeks. Didn't think much of it till just now.
And now?
Now I think a man doesn't put his hand on another man's arm like that unless he's already decided what he expects to find.
Addie's stomach went cold in a way the river water hadn't managed all morning. She did not look away this time either, because looking away, at this exact sentence, would have told him everything the sentence itself had only guessed at.
He expects to find a claim worth jumping. That's all there is to expect.
Levi looked at her a moment longer than the answer required, the way a practical man looks at a sum that will not quite balance, and then he did the thing Addie had least expected from anyone on Doyle Bar in 4 months. He let it go.
Ditch needs clearing above the second flume. I could use another set of hands before Crane finds a reason to argue about water next, same as he's arguing about ground now.
It was not friendship. It was arithmetic, one claim, one pair of hands, one common enemy walking the line with unhurried confidence. But arithmetic, Addie had learned since October, was the only kind of kindness this river reliably offered, and she had gotten good at accepting it without asking for more.
I can give you till noon, not because you asked nice.
Didn't ask nice. Asked useful.
Something in Addie's chest, unused to being spoken to plainly by anyone in 4 months of careful mornings, loosened by exactly 1 degree, not enough to notice, she told herself, walking the bank beside him toward the ditch. Not enough to matter. She would spend the better part of the next several weeks discovering how wrong that particular sentence was. They cleared gravel from the ditch until the sun stood high enough to burn the mist off the water, working in the kind of silence that asks nothing of a person pretending to be someone she is not. No questions about family. No questions about a voice that occasionally slipped half a register too high when startled. No questions about hands too fine-boned for the work they were doing, though Levi's eyes crossed those hands more than once and said nothing.
You favor your left side lifting? Old injury?
Something like that.
It was, in fact, the truth. In the crooked way half-truths often are, the injury was 4 months old and had nothing to do with lifting and everything to do with the effort of never once, in 4 months, letting her guard down enough to move the way her body actually wanted to move. Levi didn't press it. He was a man who had learned, somewhere between a war he didn't talk about and a rock slide that had taken the only partner he'd trusted, that most people's guarded places were guarded for a reason worth respecting rather than picking at, and Addie noticed that about him before she noticed almost anything else. What she did not yet notice, because she had trained herself these 4 months not to notice such things in any man, for her own safety more than her own peace, was that Levi Hargrove had already begun watching her the way a careful man watches something he cannot quite name and does not yet trust himself to name correctly. At the noon bell, she gathered her tools to walk the quarter-mile back to her own claim, and Levi said the only thing all morning that had nothing to do with ditches, stakes, or Otis Crane.
Camp meeting's Thursday next. Crane'll bring his dispute formal, if he's smart, and he is. You'll want more than your own word standing behind you when he does.
I've got the deed. Recorded, witnessed, my brother's mark on it plain as day.
Deed proves the claim was his. Doesn't prove the man working it now is.
He said it plainly, without accusation, the way a man points out a hole in a fence before the cattle find it themselves, and Addie felt the ground shift under a conversation that had, until that exact sentence, felt almost safe.
Meaning what? Hargrove.
Meaning if I were you, I'd have an answer ready for the question nobody's asked out loud yet, because come Thursday, somebody will.
He shouldered his shovel and walked back toward his own cabin without waiting to see what she made of that, and Addie stood alone on the bank a long moment, water sliding cold and constant past her boots, and understood that the one man on this river paying close enough attention to be useful to her was also, by exactly the same measure, the one man most likely to see straight through her before the week was out. She did not yet know how right she was, or how little it would end up mattering by the time the truth finally surfaced, because truth on a gravel bar, she was about to learn, has a way of surfacing on its own schedule, not anyone else's. That night, camp gathered at Mrs. Bell's cook fire the way it did most evenings, the one fixed point on Doyle Bar where 40 tired men ate beans and biscuit off tin plates and argued about claims, weather, and whichever rumor had traveled fastest downriver that week. Mrs. Bell had come west a widow, buried a husband at Sutter's Creek the first winter, and stayed on to feed miners for wages that beat starving alone in a cabin, and she watched camp the way she watched her own stove, close, constant, and rarely fooled by anything for long. She had done Charlie Doyle's washing since November. She had noticed, sometime around the second week of December, a particular binding cloth among the shirts that no man on this river had any earthly use for, and she had said nothing about it then, and she said nothing about it now, setting a plate in Addie's hands with exactly the same brisk indifference she gave every other man in the supper line. It was not kindness exactly. It was the same practical arithmetic Levi practiced without naming it, a woman keeping a secret on a river full of men who would use it against her, and Mrs. Bell, for reasons of her own that had nothing to do with sentiment, had decided months ago whose side of that arithmetic she stood on. Otis Crane sat near the fire that night holding court of his own, laying out his dispute for anyone within earshot before he ever brought it formal, the way a man rehearses an argument he already expects to win.
Miner's code says a claim goes to the man working it. Question is whether the man kneeling in that gravel every morning is the man whose name's on the deed, or whether we've all been humoring a ghost since October out of politeness.
Addie ate her supper without looking up, and felt every syllable of it land somewhere just beneath her ribs, and understood that the 4 careful months behind her had bought her exactly 1 week more, and not 1 hour past Thursday. What are you making of the two of them so far? Levi and the secret he hasn't quite put a name to yet. If this kind of slow burn keeps you hooked, alike tells the channel this is the sort of story worth putting in front of more people who'd enjoy it too. Thursday arrived the way deadlines do on a gravel bar, not slowly and not kindly. The camp meeting was held in the open, on the flat ground before the store. 40 men standing in a loose half circle with their hats off out of habit more than respect, and Otis Crane stood at the center of it with the unhurried confidence of a man who had already counted every vote he needed.
I'm asking the camp to set a deadline. 1 week from tonight for Charlie Doyle to produce a witness from before this camp, someone who knew him back east or in Sacramento, or anywhere a man could vouch for him being who he claims. Absent that, I say the claim reverts, same as any abandoned ground, and I'll file on it fair and proper the morning after.
A murmur went through the half circle, the low sound of men doing arithmetic of their own. Some sympathetic to a quiet claim holder who'd never given camp any trouble. Some simply hungry for a rich stretch of gravel to open up. None of them, Addie understood with a cold and separate clarity, owing her anything at all. Levi Hargrove stood near the front, arms crossed, and said the thing that turned the whole meeting, though it cost him something visible in his jaw to say it.
I'll stand as a witness to what I've seen. Man's worked that claim honest every day since I've known him, cleared ditch alongside me without complaint, and never once given camp reason to doubt his word till Crane started needing him to be doubted.
That's not the kind of witness the code requires, Hargrove, and you know it. Working alongside a man isn't knowing who he was before he got here.
Then the code's got a hole in it. Crane's found convenient. Same code that lets any man ride in from nowhere, stake ground, and never once be asked who he was before, either unless it's ground somebody else has already decided he wants.
It did not settle the dispute. It only bought a week. The alcalde, an old placer miner named Purnell who doubled as camp doctor when anyone needed one, set the deadline formally at 7 days and gaveled the meeting closed with the weary patience of a man who had settled 100 smaller quarrels and expected this one to resolve itself same as the rest, one way or another, without his having to think too hard about it. Addie walked back along the river in the dark that night, with her heart going harder than the walking required, and found Levi falling into step beside her without asking permission, the way he'd apparently decided he had some standing to do now.
Didn't ask you to stand up for me in front of 40 men, Hargrove.
Didn't do it because you asked? Did it because Crane's wrong and because a man who'll bend the code to steal one claim will bend it again to steal the next?
That's the only reason.
He didn't answer right away, and the not answering said more than any sentence would have, and Addie found herself glad of the dark, because whatever her own face was doing at that particular silence, she did not want it seen by lamplight or firelight or any light at all.
A witness from before this camp. You got one, Doyle? Because if you don't, 7 days isn't much of a length to invent one in.
Addie stopped walking. The river went on without her, indifferent, the way rivers do, and she looked at the one man on this bar sharp enough to have noticed every crack in her 4 months of careful mornings, and understood that the true answer to his question was going to cost her everything she had left to lose one way or the other before the week was out.
No. I don't have a witness.
It was the truest sentence she had spoken aloud since October, and saying it out loud, even that much of it, felt like setting down a weight she had been carrying so long she'd half forgotten it had a shape. Levi came by her cabin 2 evenings later with a jar of Mrs. Bell's liniment for the shoulder Addie had wrenched clearing ditch gravel that morning, which was, both of them understood without saying so, a thinner excuse than either of them required by that point to justify the visit. He sat across the small table from her, while she worked the liniment into her own shoulder rather than let him do it, because there were still some lines she was not yet ready to cross, and the fire between them in the little stove burned low and steady the way conversations do between two people who have stopped needing to fill every silence.
You asked me once why I stood up for you in front of 40 men. Wasn't only about Crane being wrong.
I gathered that much, Hargrove?
Man doesn't hate a piece of ground the way Crane hates yours without a reason older than the ground itself. I knew his brother some years back before either of us came up this particular river. Young fellow, reckless, drowned, trying to dam a creek on land some family named Doyle had staked a generation before you or your brother were ever born to it. Crane's carried that the whole time since, near as I can tell, like it's a debt somebody still owes him.
My family never farmed anywhere near a creek that took anybody's life. Whatever claim he's talking about, it isn't ours.
Doesn't much matter whether it's the same Doyles or not. Far as Crane's grief is concerned, a man carrying a debt that old isn't always particular about who he collects it from. Which means this was never only about a rich stretch of gravel, and it isn't going to end like a simple dispute over ground either.
Addie sat with that a long moment, feeling the shape of the danger change under her without quite losing its outline. Not smaller for being personal instead of merely greedy, but different. The way a storm reads different once you learn it's been building for years instead of gathering that same afternoon.
Then Thursday isn't the end of it. Whatever the code says.
No, but it's the part of it we can actually fight, so it's the part worth fighting first.
He left before the hour got late enough to cost her anything with the camp's opinion of a bachelor claim holder's comings and goings, and at the door he paused with his hand on the frame a moment longer than leaving required.
Get some sleep, Doyle. Whatever this week turns out to hold, you'll want your wits about you for it.
Addie stood in the doorway and watched him walk back toward his own claim under a sky gone thick with cloud, and felt for reasons that had very little to do with Otis Crane and a good deal to do with the particular care in a man's voice when he told her to rest. Something in her chest that had nothing at all to do with fear. A storm broke over the river 2 nights later, the kind that turns a placid feeder ditch into a threat inside an hour, and it was that storm, more than Crane's deadline, that finally forced the truth into the open. Because trouble, on a gravel bar same as anywhere else, rarely waits for a convenient week to arrive in. The upper flume gave first. Timbers Levi had meant to reinforce since October groaning loose under water they were never built to carry. And by the time Addie heard the crack of it over the range, she was already running the boundary line with a lantern that the wind kept trying to take from her. She found Levi wrist-deep in floodwater at the flume's broken joint, trying alone to wedge a brace back into timber that no longer wanted to hold one. And she waded in beside him without waiting to be asked, because some decisions on this river had stopped being about disguise a long while back and started being about whether a man she'd come, against every careful intention, to trust was about to be swept downriver in the dark.
Get clear. This whole joint could go.
Not leaving you elbow deep in it alone. Hold the brace, I'll drive the wedge.
They worked the joint together in water that climbed past their knees and then their thighs, cold enough to steal breath, loud enough that speech became mostly shouted fragments and gestures, until the brace finally caught and held, and the worst of the flood diverted safely around the claim instead of through it. They stood afterward in the ruin of the night, both of them soaked past any hope of drying before morning, and the claim shack, Levi's, closer than her own by a quarter mile she did not have strength left to walk, was the only shelter within reach that made any practical sense at all.
You'll take fever standing out here arguing about propriety. Get inside,
There was no argument to make that would not have given away more than the cold already threatened to. So Addie went inside and sat close by a small stove Levi built up from banked coals, and understood, watching steam rise off both their soaked coats in the single close room, exactly how thin the last of her careful distance had worn.
You favor your left side lifting? And now I've had my hand near yours in that water twice tonight, and both times it felt like a hand that spent its whole life not doing this kind of work.
Addie said nothing, because there was, for the first time in 4 months, genuinely nothing safe left to say, and the fire popped once in the small stove, and the silence between them stretched long enough that it became its own kind of answer.
I'm not asking to trap you, Doyle. I'm asking because I've spent 3 weeks watching you and getting a sum that won't balance, and I'd rather hear it plain from you than keep guessing wrong in front of Crane at the worst possible hour.
It was, Addie thought later, the gentlest a man had ever pushed her toward the edge of a cliff, and she stood at that edge a long moment with the stove's heat finally reaching her soaked hands, and made the kind of decision that only gets made once a person has run entirely out of other choices.
My name is Adelaide Doyle. Charlie was my brother. He died of camp fever in October, 3 weeks after we filed this claim together, and I have been him ever since because a woman can't hold place or ground on this river, and I had nowhere else on God's earth left to go.
She said it fast, the way a person pulls a splinter rather than easing it, and then she said nothing further, because there was nothing further that explaining could fix, only things that Levi's next sentence would either mend or break for good. He was quiet long enough that Addie's whole body went cold again, colder than the flood had managed, bracing for the sound of a man's trust curdling into something else. Betrayal, disgust, the particular fear men reserved for being made a fool of in front of 40 others. What came instead was quieter than any of that, and stranger, and it took Addie a moment to recognize it for what it was.
3 weeks. You've been carrying that alone in a one-room camp for 3 weeks I've known you, and longer besides that, I didn't.
4 months.
4 months.
He said the number back to her the way a man tests the weight of something before deciding what to do with it. And then he did the thing Addie had least expected from any man on this river, least of all one she had just handed the power to destroy her entirely.
Then you've had 4 months of being smarter and steadier than most men on this bar manage in a lifetime, and I'll be damned if I hand that to Crane on a plate just because the truth of it makes me look a fool for not seeing it sooner.
It was not a declaration. It would take days yet before either of them called it what it plainly already was. But it was the first true safety Addie Doyle had been offered since her brother's grave went cold, and she sat by that small stove a long while after, saying very little, because some relief runs too deep for words to carry it properly. Dr. Purnell came by the claim the very next day under the excuse of checking the flume repair for the camp's safety records, and Addie, still favoring a wrenched shoulder from the flood, let him look at it without much thought because a camp doctor's visits had never once, in 4 months, been anything but routine. She did not yet know that Otis Crane had been paying Purnell in gold dust since the week the dispute began, for exactly the kind of small, useless-seeming observation a doctor makes without thinking twice. A wrist too narrow, a collarbone shaped wrong for the work it did, a reluctance to strip past the shirt that any other miner on the bar would have shrugged off without a second glance. Purnell said nothing to her face. He said everything that same night, to Otis Crane, over a bottle neither of them touched much, because the words alone were worth more to Crane than the whiskey.
You're certain?
Purnell was certain enough, and Crane smiled the way a man smiles when a hand he'd been bluffing suddenly fills itself out true, and understood that he no longer needed a missing witness at all. He needed only to say the right sentence, at the right volume, in front of the whole camp, and let Doyle Bar do the rest of the work for him. Purnell did not do it for spite, particular, or even much for the gold dust, if you pressed him on it honestly, which nobody on that river ever bothered to do. He did it because a doctor's fees on a placer bar rarely covered a doctor's debts, and because Otis Crane had quietly settled 2 seasons of Purnell's unpaid store account the same week he'd first asked, in passing, whether the doctor had noticed anything unusual tending to Charlie Doyle's shoulder after the flood. A debt paid so smoothly, Purnell had barely registered what he was actually being asked to trade for it, until the words were already out of his mouth in Crane's cabin, 2 bottles deep, and past calling back. Crane, for his part, felt nothing like triumph hearing it confirmed. Only the old familiar settling of a grudge finally finding somewhere solid to stand, the way it had been failing to find solid ground for 11 years, since a creek he'd never forgiven took the one person in his life he'd never once had to pretend to like. None of that made him right. It only made him human. In the particular tired, dangerous way grief curdles into something a man mistakes for justice when he's carried it alone too long, a shape the narrator has seen more than once in more than one man, on more rivers than this one. Levi heard the first whisper of Purnell's loose talk from a storekeeper 2 days before the deadline, and came to Addie's claim at a near run, which was, for a man of Levi Hargrove's usual pace, close enough to alarm to tell her everything before he said a word.
Purnell's been talking.
Good.
Crane's known since Tuesday. He means to say it out loud at the meeting, in front of the whole camp, and let the camp do his work for him rather than have to prove a thing himself.
Then it's over. Whatever I say Thursday, it won't matter what proof I bring, only what I am.
It matters plenty. Difference between a claim reverting for fraud and a claim standing because the woman working it has every right the code allows. That's not the same outcome, Doyle. That's 2 entirely different Thursdays.
The code doesn't allow it. You said so yourself. First week, I knew you.
I said the code as Crane reads, it doesn't allow it. Purnell's not the only man on this river who can read a filing. I rode through Rich Bar a couple months back and watched a widow named Shannon hold her husband's claim in her own name, filed proper, witnessed proper, because the code says the ground goes to whoever works it honest and keeps up the assessment, and nowhere in that sentence does it say the hands doing the working have to be a man's.
It was not a certainty. It was a thread, thin and untested on this particular bar, and Addie held onto it the way a person holds onto any thread offered at the exact moment they have run out of rope. They spent what daylight remained riding to the next camp downriver to find the recorder who had witnessed the Shannon filing, a dry, careful man named Beckwith who kept his ledgers the way some men keep their Bibles. Beckwith heard the whole business out with his spectacles pushed up onto his forehead, unhurried, the way a man reads a contract twice before he'll sign anything to it. He couldn't ride up to Doyle Bar and settle their dispute for them. He said at last that was Purnell's job as alcalde, but he could tell them plainly what was written and what had already been argued, and let their own man make of it what he would.
That's all I'm asking, Mr. Beckwith. The truth of the wording, nothing more.
He opened the ledger to the Shannon filing and read it aloud twice, slow, the way a man reads something he wants another person to be able to repeat back word for word if it comes to that, and confirmed over the better part of an hour that the code's actual language said working claimant, not male claimant, and that the omission had been argued and settled in the widow Shannon's favor not 2 months before, with no challenge raised against it since. If any man tried to tell their camp otherwise, he added, they were welcome to ride down and argue it with him directly. He didn't much care for having settled law relitigated by men who'd never once bothered to read it themselves. It would not silence Crane. It would not undo 4 months of disguise or erase the fact of Purnell's betrayal or make the coming Thursday anything but the hardest hour of Addie Doyle's life so far. But it meant she would walk into that meeting with something more solid under her than her own frightened word, and Levi Hargrove rode the whole way back beside her in a silence that had, sometime in the last 2 days, stopped being the silence of 2 wary strangers and become something considerably harder to name. They stopped to water the horses at a bend where the river ran quiet, and Levi finally said the thing he had apparently been carrying since the flood 2 nights before.
I've spent 3 weeks trying to work out what it was about you I couldn't stop noticing, Doyle. Adelaide and I kept landing on the wrong answer every time because I kept looking for reasons a man distrusts a partner instead of reasons a man starts caring for one.
You don't know the first true thing about me. 4 months of Charlie Doyle isn't a woman you know, Hargrove. It's a costume you happen to like the fit of.
I know a person who ran a flooding flume elbow deep in freezing water rather than let a man she barely trusted drown alone in it. I know a person who's held a dead brother's ground 4 months against 40 men and a liar with money, without once asking anybody to rescue her from it. Costume didn't do any of that. You did?
Addie looked at him a long moment in the fading light, water running past both their boots the way it had the very first morning, and felt something in her chest give way that 4 months of careful mornings had not managed to protect after all. Not fear this time, but its opposite, which frightened her nearly as much.
If Thursday goes against me, I lose the claim, the name, and whatever this is, all in the same afternoon.
Then we make Thursday not go against you, together this time, not you carrying it alone in the dark, same as you've been carrying it since October.
He did not kiss her there at the river bend, though the narrator will tell you plainly that both of them stood close enough and wanted to, and let the moment pass anyway out of the same careful instinct that had kept Addie alive 4 months. Because some declarations, the wise ones, wait for solid ground before they're spoken, and Thursday was not yet solid ground for either of them. Thursday arrived gray and still. The whole camp gathered again on the flat before the store, and this time there was no pretending it was routine business. Every man on Doyle Bar had heard some version of Purnell's whisper by now, and the half circle that formed around Otis Crane was thicker and quieter than the week before.
I told this camp I'd bring a witness question, and I've got something better than a witness. I've got the truth plain, from a man with no reason to lie about it. Charlie Doyle's been dead since October. The person working that claim these 4 months is his sister, dressed and living as him, and every day she's done it, she's made fools of every man on this bar who tipped his hat to a woman he thought was a man.
The murmur that went through the camp this time was not the low, arithmetical sound of the week before. It was sharper, uglier. The particular sound 40 men make when they feel, rightly or not, that something has been taken from them without their consent, and Addie stood at the center of it, hat finally off, hair loose in the gray morning light for the first time since October, and let them look.
Everything he said is true. My name is Adelaide Doyle. I have worked this claim honest, cleared the shared ditch alongside Levi Hargrove without complaint, paid every assessment on time, and broken no law of this camp's code that I have been able to find written down anywhere. Because I looked, gentlemen, same as any of you would have, before I risked my life on it.
The law's not written down because no man ever imagined he'd need to write it down. Nobody imagined a woman fool enough to try this.
It was the alcalde, old Purnell, who answered that. Not out of any sudden loyalty to Addie, but out of the same stubborn fairness that had made him a passable judge of camp disputes for 2 winters running. Once the shame of his own loose talk had a chance to settle sourly in his stomach overnight. Code said the claim went to the working claimant who kept current on assessment and improvement, he told the circle. Didn't say man nowhere in it that he could find, and he'd read it more times than any of them, seeing as he was the fool who had to enforce it. Same language had stood for the widow Shannon down at the next bar not 2 months back, filed and witnessed proper, and nobody had ridden down there to unfile it since. Crane's face did the thing a face does when a hand it believed unbeatable turns out to have 1 card fewer than it needed, and he reached, the way cornered men do, for the only weapon he had left that wasn't strictly about the deed at all.
Fraud's fraud, whatever the code says about pronouns, Purnell. She lied to every man on this bar for 4 months. That's not a filing question. That's a character question, and I say a camp's got the right to judge a person's character before it hands them 40 acres of gravel.
It was Levi who stepped forward then, not as a witness this time, but as a man with something plainer to settle. And the narrator will tell you that what he said next did more to turn that half circle than any line of Beckwith's ledger had managed.
Then judge mine alongside hers, Crane, because I've known the truth 3 days now and stood beside her through every hour of it, and I'll tell this whole camp plain. There's not a man standing in this circle I'd trust to run a flooding flume at midnight or hold 4 months of grief and fear alone without once asking for help the way I've watched Adelaide Doyle do since October. If that's the character question, I'd wager most of you already know your own answer, and it isn't the one Crane's hoping for.
A long quiet followed, the kind that settles over 40 men when a plain thing has finally been said out loud that most of them had half suspected all along and simply lacked the nerve to name first. It was Mrs. Bell, of all people, who broke it, stepping out from the edge of the circle where the camp's women rarely spoke first, wiping her hands on her apron the way she did 50 times a day without thinking, and saying the thing she'd apparently been sitting on since December. She'd done that girl's washing since November and known the truth of her near as long, she told them, and she'd tell them men something for nothing. She'd mended more torn shirts and fevered brows in this camp on the quiet than half of them had ever thanked her for, thinking she was a close-mouthed young man doing a neighborly turn. Character question was already answered, far as she was concerned, and it had been answered months back. A younger miner near the back, a boy scarcely 20 named Tobias Fenn, who had broken his wrist on a rockfall in January, spoke up next without anybody calling on him to, the way a person does when they've been quietly waiting weeks for the right moment to settle a debt of their own. Charlie Doyle, Mrs. Doyle, had set his wrist straight the night Purnell was 3 sheets to the wind and couldn't be found, he said. Didn't have to. Wasn't her claim's business, wasn't her trouble. Did it anyway? Past midnight, by lantern, and never once asked him to keep quiet about who'd done it. He didn't much care what she was called. He cared she was the reason he'd still got a hand that worked. More than one man in that half-circle shifted his weight at that, the particular shuffling of 40 tired men remembering, all at once, some small private kindness they'd each quietly received from the person they'd spent the morning ready to condemn. Crane looked around the half-circle and understood, the way a gambler understands the exact moment a table has turned against him for good, that Purnell's ledger, Levi's plain word, Mrs. Bell's 4 months of quiet loyalty, and now a boy's mended wrist had between them done what no single argument of his own could undo.
This isn't finished, Doyle.
It was for today, Purnell told him, unless he had a filing to make against a legal claim, which by the code just read out loud he didn't. And while they were settling accounts, Purnell added, Beckwith had let him know a man matching Crane's description was asking after the Doyle boundary stakes back in November. The same week one of them turned up moved 40 feet upriver of its recorded line. That a matter he'd care to discuss with the camp as well. Or should they let it lie for now? Crane said nothing further. He did not need to. The silence that followed him back through the crowd said everything the camp needed to understand about exactly how much of his grievance had ever been about the code at all, and how much had simply been about a grudge 11 years deep, finally spent and finally, plainly, alone. What is it about someone finally being seen for who they really are, after months of having to hide it, that lands so hard? Is that a moment you've ever lived yourself, watched someone you love go through, or simply hoped for on somebody's behalf? Tell me in the comments. I'd like to know which one brought you here tonight. The camp dispersed slowly after that, the way crowds do once the real drama has finished and only the ordinary business of a Thursday morning remains, men drifting back toward their claims in 2s and 3s, already turning the morning story into the kind of tale that would outlive the actual gravel it happened on. Addie stood at the center of the emptying flat with her hair still loose, her hat still in her hand, feeling for the first time in 4 months, the strange and almost frightening lightness of being looked at plainly and not found wanting for it. Levi crossed the last of the distance between them without any of the careful pacing that had governed every conversation since October, and Addie let him, because there was, at last, nothing left standing between them that either of them needed to hide.
Adelaide Doyle, never once got to say your whole name out loud to your face till just now.
Took you long enough, Hargrove.
Man likes to be sure of his ground before he stakes a claim on it.
And now?
Now I'm about as sure as I've ever been of anything on this river.
He kissed her there on the flat, in front of whichever miners hadn't quite finished drifting off yet, and the narrator will tell you that not one of them so much as looked twice, which was, in its own quiet way, the truest measure of how completely that morning it settled the only question that had ever really mattered. Spring came on fully within the month, the way it does on a river that has spent a hard winter deciding what it means to hold ground worth keeping. Addie filed the claim formally under her own name at the recorder's office downriver, with Beckwith's careful hand and Purnell's plain testimony behind her, and no man on Doyle Bar ever again mistook her for anyone but exactly who she was. She and Levi combined the 2 claims that summer, the way the shared ditch had always half suggested they should, and the ground between the 2 boundary lines. The very stretch Otis Crane had once tried to move a stake across in the dark became simply Doyle Bar, worked by 2 names instead of one borrowed one. Otis Crane left the river before the summer thaw finished, his own grudge finally too plainly named in front of 40 men to carry any further weight on that stretch of gravel, and the narrator will not pretend his leaving solved the grief underneath it, only that it left him, at last, somewhere else to carry it. Addie kept her brother's pocket watch on the mantel of the cabin she and Levi built that autumn, its case still engraved with Charlie's initials, stopped now at the hour she had finally stopped needing to borrow his name to survive. Not put away, not forgotten, simply set down at last where it could rest instead of run. A person does what a person has to do to hold on to the ground that matters to them, and sometimes that means becoming someone else for a while, carrying a borrowed name through the hardest months of a life, just to keep from losing everything underneath it. The question worth asking, once the ground is finally safe again, is who you find yourself to be once you finally get to set that borrowed name back down. Addie Doyle found out on a gray Thursday morning on the Feather River. I expect a fair number of you listening have found out the same thing yourselves, in your own way, on your own river. I'd like to hear about it, if you're willing to share it.